Bien, bonjour à tous. Nous allons commencer la séance d'aujourd'hui, la deuxième séance avec Uta et Chris Frith. C'est Uta qui va nous parler dans un instant des causes de l'autisme et également, comme elle avait promis à un moment, des liens entre autisme et talent, même si c'est un domaine qui est encore difficile à étudier. But before starting the conference, I'd like to say two things. First, I'd like to say that your lecture of last week is already online on the Collège de France website, so don't hesitate to tell the poor people who cannot come to these lectures, maybe they are abroad or they are outside Paris, that they can watch them already on the Collège de France website. And second, as usual, there is a little gift from Collège de France for the professors who visit here, and this is a special medal which is has a picture of Collège de France and your name on the side, and
wonderful.
This is a gift for foreign professors who come and delight us with their presentation. So thank you very much, Uta, for your visit.
Thank you very much. This is very wonderful.
So now, without further ado, I'll let you present on understanding the symptoms of autism.
Well, thank you very, very much. What a surprise. How very nice. I really want to give you today quite a personal account of autism research. It struck me as very, very strange when I was standing back a little and thought, what did I actually do in my life? And to discover that we know about autism, and we did research on autism all over the world at about the same time as my own lifespan, which I think is quite extraordinary. So the discovery of autism really only dates back to the 1940s, not really so long ago. Of course, it doesn't mean that autism didn't exist before, it just wasn't identified before. And it was about 20 years, I think, till this concept even had some credibility and people did know something about it. Then it took another 20 years, I think, to come to internationally agreed criteria of a diagnosis. What I really want to talk to you, of course, about are theories based on cognitive psychology. So it is a personal view. It is very much about my own work and that of my close colleagues. And then I will say something about the most recent years, the sort of expansion, exploration of ideas that probably started already back in the 1960s, perhaps. So starting with the early years of autism, discovery of autism, of course we have the two pioneers, Hans Asperger and Leo Kanner, who at the same time used the same label to describe the same kinds of children that they saw in their clinic. Very few children, of course. It was considered to be a very rare, very, very unusual disorder. And here you have the three core symptoms that were coined by Leo Kanner: autistic aloneness, insistence on sameness, and islets of ability. That was the sort of beginning. These were the kind of core concepts of autism. But everybody was asking, what kind of a thing is autism? What kind of causes does it have? Should we talk about what was then called organic causes, some kind of disorder of the brain, possibly some fault in the genes? Or should we talk about psychosocial causes? Of course, between 1940 and 1960, the psychosocial causes were the ones that were highly favored. People were thinking about treatment in terms of psychotherapy, perhaps not of the child, but of the mother. People were wondering whether there was a hidden intelligence or instead a really severe learning disability, and nobody knew really. Some people guessed what would happen when the autistic child grew up. So this was an extraordinary time when we only knew about autistic children, only about very, very few who had these particular symptoms. As I said, it took about another 20 years for the concept to be generally accepted, discussed, agreed, and enshrined in diagnostic and statistical manuals. You can see lots of volumes, and you know very well this is a work in progress. So there is now DSM-5 being prepared, and there are further changes in the concept of autism. I might say something about this perhaps in the discussion time. So nevertheless, for researchers, this is good news because there are internationally agreed behavioral criteria, not biological criteria, behavioral criteria. And thank God, everyone agrees now that there are organic causes. Autism happens in the brain, and there is a genetic origin. And thank God people have recognized that behavior modification and the many, many variations of this is the method of choice and not psychotherapy. Also, what we now know, what we didn't really know early on, there are very high-functioning individuals, very able individuals, people who have autism who are also highly intelligent. And this is part of the idea of a whole spectrum of autistic disorders, which is marked by incredible heterogeneity. This is an interesting problem, that there should be this spectrum, and there should be a far bigger range of symptoms in terms of severity, intensity, and so on, than was ever conceived in the 1940s, 50s, and even early 60s. And of course, one other thing we know now, we do know what happens when the autistic child grows up. It is a lifelong disorder. The child doesn't get miraculously cured. The autism doesn't go away. Now, interestingly, the new frontier of our knowledge is what happens in old age. No research exists as yet. Again, it is, I feel it was just like my own lifetime, saying, well, we're just growing up with autism as it was first recognized, and see what happens next. Now, I must mention the film Rain Man, which came out in 1989, because it's a little bit of a watershed. Of course, I don't want to say that autism, the film about Rain Man caused this increased awareness of autism everywhere, but it did have a role to play. I think you can date also an explosion of autism research from about 1889. You certainly from then on have the recognition of autism in adulthood, and because of this film, I think very much an increasing interest in savant talents. As you know, Rain Man was very famous for his feats of memory. Now, another thing is it's not just an explosion of research, but also an explosion of cases. And naturally, the question it's right to ask, is this really just due to increase in awareness and to having these broad criteria of a whole spectrum, or is there a real increase? Of course, it's a very, very interesting question. And the final answer, we don't really know yet, but people like me put a bet on saying, yeah, it's increase in awareness. It's not a real increase in cases. Why do I say this? Well, one reason is that here we have two curves. The top one, the dotted one, shows you the decrease of cases that were diagnosed in California as mentally retarded. And the black line shows you an increase in cases that are diagnosed as autistic. So you can see they're almost cancelling each other out. It is as if children who would previously have been vaguely diagnosed as mentally retarded of unknown origin, now at least a very high proportion will be diagnosed as having autism. And another reason encourages me to think that it's not a real increase in case is that this is very, very new statistical data from California. Again, if it is true that it's all due to the increased awareness of autism and the broadening of the criteria, we should get a leveling off. It shouldn't go on and on increasing. And perhaps there is a little sign of leveling off. I take this, but we have to watch. Now, today, this is just to give you this background. I think the agreement is it's a neurodevelopmental disorder. It has a base in the brain, an origin in the genes. It affects about 1% of the population. Who would have thought that it is so frequent? There is a 3-to-1 male-female ratio. Autism can occur at all levels of ability, yet 50% have some mild to severe learning difficulties, and 10 to possibly 30%, this are the sort of latest figures, have some kind of special talents. So it always depends on how you define special talent. The 10%, you're quite strict with your criteria. The 30%, if you allow some kind of better than average memory performance, for example, or hyperlexia, which is one of the possible savant skills. Now, I want to talk about research, this history of autism research, and about cognitive research. I won't talk about any other research. And for me, certainly the starting point was the work by Hermelin O'Connor between 1960 and 1980. I was the lucky PhD student who worked in their lab, and I absorbed all that they had built up and prepared. They themselves came from a tradition of research in mental retardation or mental deficiency, as it was called then, and they investigated with neuropsychological techniques, indeed, how whether there were specific problems or whether the problem in these individuals was of a completely general nature. So it turned out, and this was the basis of my own work, that autism was very much characterized by specificity, so that you could see that not all mental functions were sort of derailed or strange or bizarre. And this encouraged me to think, certainly, that there are modules in the mind, which with some functioning quite well and some not. This is, again, a classic neuropsychology paradigm. And furthermore, this encouraged us to think there will be some mechanisms that can be found eventually, computational mechanisms, hopefully, that can be linked to neural mechanisms, to brain function. So, of course, it assumes that hypothesis about the nature of a specific dysfunction can be tested, and it also assumes, and I think we were quite aware of this at the time, that there will be many false trails, but you should not be discouraged. You should have hypotheses, you should use your imagination, you should try out new ideas to find out what kind of a thing autism is. And I will talk about these two major cognitive theories of the 80s, between 80 and 1990. And again, I'm taking a personal view here. I've actually found this old transparency, and it was interesting to me. The date is about 85, it could be around about that time. I looked at all the symptoms of autism that I thought were very relevant, very difficult to explain, and that you couldn't just forget about some of them and concentrate on others. I thought they would have to be tackled if we consider autism an entity, not just a conglomeration of many different kinds of things. And it seemed also that some of these symptoms, for example, the aloofness or lack of ability to pretend, problems in pragmatic communication and so on, would all have to do with something that should be called social cognition, and something with a theory was needed to explain these peculiar symptoms. And then there were many other features that had to do with restricted interests and hypersensitivity and memory and all sorts of other things, but also islets of ability or savant skills, and something non-social, it seemed to me then, should be needed to explain this odd collection. So not going for a completely unified theory, but still pretty simple, and I'm sure far too simple. But these are the sort of major thoughts that were around at the time. And indeed, here's another transparency from, I think, the same talk, where I made very clear that there are these ideas which may be completely wrong, but they're there. One idea called mentalizing, another idea called central coherence, and at the cognitive level, these concepts had some meaning because you could link them. You could actually test them using a particular test battery, and you had to overcome this problem of circularity, that you didn't just have behavior and called it something else, by trying to have some novel predictions, by trying to find some tests that would actually get at this cognitive concept. I really admit it was incredibly vague at the time, and many people thought it was quite crazy, and there were stupid words, and you shouldn't use them. And even now, I think people think that they are not the right words. So it just suggests you these are just ideas, and we we do have to find words for them sometime. I will talk about just mentalizing to begin with, and then I go to central coherence. So here are the explorers of mentalizing, and I think really the most important figures, and I try to get photos of what they looked like at the time that developed the theory. I'm not quite sure I succeeded, but Joseph Perner doesn't look like that anymore, and maybe there's a person you wouldn't recognize at all, but guess what? It's me. And Alan Leslie, Simon Baron-Cohen, and Francesca Happe. So we did think about this interesting theory and how it could be applied to autism. And of course, just to remind you what I mean by mentalizing I mean that we automatically attribute mental states to others, what they know, what they think, feel, and desire, and predict what they are going to do. So even now, it's a big mouthful to say all this, and you might as well say, why? You know, there are simple and basic perceptual processes. Why don't you go for those instead of this high-level cognitive skill? My answer to this is between 1966 and 1980, I did nothing but explore perception and memory and attention and all these things and didn't really get anywhere. So, why mentalizing? Well, it seemed a good idea at the time. It was a novel idea at the time, but it would be something that you could postulate underlies precisely a combination of symptoms, which are called social interaction, communication, verbal and non-verbal, and imagination and pretense, all at the time the key features, the so-called triad of impairments that defined autism. This was DSM-3. At the time. So it would fit those particular social and slightly non-social problems. This, of course, you know, as the Salian test, as one way of operationalizing what is meant by mentalizing theory of mind. And Simon Baron-Cohen, who was my PhD student at the time, carried out the tests. And here, for example, you see the results. Only 20% of autistic children aged about 9 and quite a good mental age, passed this test, while the vast majority, 85% of children with mental retardation, many of them Down syndrome, and indeed most perfectly normally developing 4 to 6 year olds passed this test. And this paradigm was indeed developed by Wimmer and Perner, and they also found that most normally developing 4 to 6 year olds passed this test. So this mentalizing idea, mentalizing failure, attempts to explain very specifically impairments in social interaction, communication, imagination, and pretense of the kind that we find in autism. And how exactly does it explain the behavioral science? And this is a method which we call slightly laughingly the method of fine cuts, and I'm sure actually it's just a proper general scientific method, but it gave us a lot of fun to talk about it with Francesca Happe and Beate Sodian at the time. And we're saying we have to contrast in a very fine cut way, to cut nature at the joints to see what mentalizing does in social behavior and what kind of social behavior exists that you can explain perfectly well without this mentalizing idea. But here's the fine cut in an experiment, which I think is not so very well known, which I carried out with Beate Sodian and was published in 1992. Shall I briefly lead you through this? If it is well known, I will jump it, but I think it isn't. So this is an example of a fine cut where you have two conditions which are extremely similar, except for this critical difference. One condition, deception, requires you to mentalize, to attribute mental states to others, and sabotage doesn't. So the setup is this: it's a typical play scenario. You have a thief and a friend. A thief wants to steal a sweetie from the box that's on the table. There's this sort of like a treasure chest, and there is a padlock and a key. And of course, the child can keep the sweet safe from the thief simply by locking the box. That's what we call sabotage. Of course, you play out all the different variations. The child must not lock the box when the friend comes. Of course, very tempting for any child to use a lock and key if they're available, but we had to set up the situation that there was a fine cut. Now, look at deception. Same box, same idea, same thief, same friend, but no padlock, no key. So how do you prevent the thief from getting at the sweet? Well, of course, with the power of the mind. What happens is this. We set this up, of course, for children by having the thief come from afar and saying, I wonder if this box is open or locked. I'm not going to bother to come all this long way if the box is locked. And then ask the child, is this box open or is it locked? And the child should say, it's locked, even if it's a complete lie. Then the thief would say, okay, I'm not bothering to come. Now, you can only do this if you understand that you can affect the mental state of the thief in this way, as if you had a padlock and key. Mental means versus physical means. Now, the results are here, and this is again showing you what we mean by fine cut. First of all, the sabotage condition, the three groups that we had, normal children, retarded children, autistic children, were performing at the same level. Of course, not 100%, but you don't get that. But look at the deception condition. It's much more difficult. Children don't really like to tell a lie, even if the experimenter wills them and rewards them for telling a lie. But look at this fine cut. Look at this absolute impossibility in the autistic group to do this mental deception. So, just to give you this example, but I'm carrying on to use the fine cuts method for everyday social behavior. So how do you look at everyday social behavior? It's extremely difficult because, we always think, we would love to observe the behavior and note it all down. And in the end, all we do is use questionnaires. And this is what we did here. There are some very detailed questionnaires called Vineland Adaptive Behavior Scales. They're all about social behavior. You ask the carer, usually the parent, who knows the child very well, an enormous number of questions, and they are divided into different categories. One is called communication, daily living skills, socialization. Now, very gross categories, and you can see this is normal, mentally retarded children, and here the autistic children, and you could see there is this huge difference here in this area called socialization. But we wanted to know what on earth was actually being asked about, what this behavior was about, shouldn't their behavior, and also why is communication, strangely enough, rather better? We want to explain both lack of communication, lack of social interaction, and all of these things. Well, of course, we suspected that this questionnaire did not distinguish between behavior that requires mentalizing and behavior that doesn't. So we made up questions, and we divided the questions given in this questionnaire in such a way that we could distinguish this kind of behavior. So we believe, for example, that a question that says, if you talk to your child, it would be done in a kind of nice interview. The parent doesn't just fill in a questionnaire. Would the child, provide missing information spontaneously? We think only if, for example, the child has a stomach pain. Would the child then actually say, I have a stomach pain? That's missing information to the adult. Or could the child do something like choosing an appropriate present for somebody else? Would the child recognize embarrassment? Or, very difficult one, can the child keep secrets and confidence? Actually, they were not children, they were adolescents, young people. So they were quite appropriate questions to ask. And behavior, that's also in this sort of social communication domain, that does not require mentalizing, was also asked. For example, does the child provide redundant information, carrying on about things that everyone knows anyway? Yes. Is the child happy, has a desire to please others? Yes, doesn't require mentalizing. Does the child recognize happiness or sadness, emotions? Doesn't require mentalizing. They're perfectly obvious cues that can be learned. Does the child initiate social context? That's absolutely fine. You don't need to be able to mentalize to do that. So doing this kind of juxtaposition, I'm just giving you here an example. We found that indeed, whether or not you were able to pass a theory of mind task really did matter. But it only mattered in the behavior that required mentalizing, according to the categorization that I've shown you before. So if this is all about autistic children, you found children who failed had very poor scores on these items. Children who passed had very good scores. And here as well, while behavior that does not require mentalizing couldn't distinguish between these two types of children or young adults. Now, really, we were interested in the subtle difficulties in mentalizing, even in those children who could pass the theory of mind task, the typical salient task. And we did indeed find more and more very able adults with a mild form of autistic disorder, now usually called people with Asperger's syndrome. And one test we used, which again, there is a whole variety of tests, some more sensitive than others, but this was one that we were quite interested in, namely the Hyder and Simmel effect. I'm always annoyed that this PowerPoint corrects, whenever I put an L here, automatically spelling corrects into Simmer, but it's Simmel effect. So normally we are compelled to attribute mental states to animated shapes. This is what Hyder and Simmel found, that you can show animated triangles and other geometric shapes, and you get the idea that these are little agents and they have mental states. You can't help it. Let's try and see. Here's one for you to consider. Just triangles moving together. I hope you're feeling compelled to think of this as two little agents doing things together. So attributing mental states to these triangles certainly requires mentalizing, and very active mentalizing when you do it when there really is no call for it. But it's a little story, a little scenario, something along the lines of come out and play. It's nice out here. I don't know whether you saw this. But of course, not every animation of triangles will evoke mental state attribution. There are others. So here's another one that we think doesn't really invite mentalizing. Most people just say, well, they're triangles, they're just sort of floating around. End of story. So again, a fine cat. It goes on and on. There's no story, they're just drifting and floating. Now, this is a kind of test that's at the sort of verge of being explicit or implicit. It's not quite clear. It's explicit to the extent that we ask people to say what happened, what actually happened. Can they describe the story in some way? And the implicit part is that while you're watching, it might just trigger this in you, but so it's not a very, very pure test, not a very sensitive test even. But on the whole, at least to begin with, when our subjects had never seen these animations, they were really incredibly bad at finding the story, at giving us the right words. As you can see, the contrast between what ordinary people like you would have given these purple lines, they would have given the right theme most of the time. These autistic people didn't. Now you can see these on YouTube, you can see these on the web, and we find that they've lost their power. People come and say, oh, I know these triangles. This is when they are, having some kind of playing in the garden kind of game. So we can, however, using these two different kinds of triangles to do the usual subtraction method, that's so useful in neuroimaging studies. So we measure brain activity while people are watching interacting triangles, the ones that make you automatically attribute mental states, and we compare it with brain activity while you're watching the randomly moving triangles. And of course, just this comparison can show you that extra activity when healthy adults show this explicit mentalizing. And here it is, medial prefrontal cortex, superior temporal sulcus at the temporoparietal junction and basal temporal and amygdaloid regions. I'm showing it because this has been repeated also with different materials. It does seem to be a system, a distributed system, which is active over and above any other areas in the brain that are active when we are attributing mental states to others. So, having found the system, what is the case for autism? This was, of course, the crunch time to test this very mad theory and see whether it had any power at a sort of neurocognitive level. And indeed, we found that the autism group showed reduced brain activation in the mentalizing system, and in fact, probably due to poorer connectivity between components of the system. But more, unfortunately, we can't yet say. I think there is an enormous amount of work that still needs to be done. I'm just showing you a summary slide of the comparison of the normal healthy brains and the autistic brains, looking at these triangles, showing these critical areas, and showing you here differences between the groups. So here's one area, the extrastriate cortex, not part of the mentalizing system, but responding to the much more interesting movement characteristics in the interesting animations, the interesting scenarios. So there is equal activity in both groups. The extrastriate cortex finds these kinds of movements really very interesting. But look at the mentalizing system itself. There is a huge difference between normal and autistic, much reduced in autism. And we can also say that there is reduced connectivity between precisely this normally functioning system and all these anterior regions. So it is as if the perception is fine, everything is there, but the interpretation is somehow not there. So we are looking at a very high level cognitive disability. And here I'm just showing you that there was a replication with exactly these triangle animations by another lab, which does give us confidence. And they also found weaker connectivity between regions in the autism group. But I gave you last time an update of the mentalizing hypothesis. I'll be very brief today talking about this. So we have really enough evidence now to know that even if you're autistic, explicit mentalizing can be learned in a compensatory fashion. So to give explicit mentalizing tests will not discriminate, will not actually tap the real, true, implicit mentalizing ability. But you can still assess implicit mentalizing by eye gaze, a method developed in the infant lab, and you can show that this ability is absent, even in very able autistic adults. So I showed this last time, so I'm not showing it again. I'm just showing you the results again, that the anticipatory looking to the correct target in the autism group is practically absent, but it's certainly true that you can find it in normal adults. So even when the autistic individuals have learned to pass Salian tests and many other similar tests, their eye movements show, they betray in a way that they lack spontaneous mentalizing. But let's come to central coherence. We come to the other part. Why central coherence? What on earth, what does it mean, and why think of it at all? Well, it had to do very much with the puzzle of the very uneven cognitive abilities in autism. So here is a typical case of Wechsler subtests, and you can see there's one in particular, block design. Look at that. These are the more normally able children, and these are the less able children, and you see how there is a very similar kind of peak and trough. These are children who are matched for sort of average IQ, and they're relatively flat. You don't get these huge differences between peaks and trough. And of course, the presence of savant talent. It has to be explained. It is such an intriguing phenomenon. It's not a coincidence. Now, central coherence, this idea was an attempt to explain peaks and troughs. Let me explain to you what I mean by it and how I got to it. This was actually the beginning. This was the source. And in fact, it stems to to my my PhD even, and I think it was such an intriguing finding to me that was from a very, very simple memory experiment, a memory for random lists of words. And you can see we have 3 groups. The autistic children were really pretty good. I'm sorry, I don't have any error bars. We didn't have them in those days. But this is the actual slide that we used, and you see we wouldn't say subnormal. That would be totally... but, you know, this is history for you. This is the slide that I used, 1971. And, of course, the experiment was conducted much earlier. And here is the case for sentences, where the words were organized in proper sentences, and of course everybody improves. It's much easier to recall this sort of list of words when they're packaged in a whole, in a sentence, in something meaningful. Except the autistic, look at that. I think they increased a tiny bit, but it was absolutely shockingly little. And they, in a sense, you know, you had that feeling it was all one to them. And one sort of explanation that occurred to me is that perhaps global meaning is the norm, and to do something piecemeal and remember word by word that is randomly connected is actually very costly. And in autism, perhaps it's the other way around. Perhaps piecemeal is the norm and global meaning is costly. So that was actually in my PhD, 1968. Now, there was another clue. A very talented PhD student of mine, Amita Shah, did an experiment with hidden figures, where, here's an example, but you know these figures, they're really, really cleverly designed to mislead you. You know, you look at the whole of the figure. In fact, you're supposed to find this one, which breaks all the rules, embedded here. And very much to our, I think, to our delight, we found that the autistic children, on the whole, equated for age, mental age, and so on, were rather better. I mean, this is just number correct, but we also have reaction time measures and so on. So it fitted this idea that perhaps maybe they can see piecemeal. It's actually not very costly for them to do this disembedding, which is often very, very hard to do for many people. Now, interestingly, this idea of, so central coherence means, strong central coherence would mean you can't see any embedded figures. Weak central coherence would mean you're very good at finding embedded figures. And this is the term that I just used. And it seemed to fit with clinical observation that sort of suggested that there was somehow little influence of context on behavior that you often saw. And here's a clinical anecdote that just put into a picture. So the psychologist asks in a sort of naming test the child, what's this, what's that? And you know, you can see what it is, a doll, a bed, a quilt, and then points to this and says, which is cushion or pillow, what's this? And the child says, you know, completely deadpan, a piece of ravioli. Now, it's a marvelous answer. It really looks like a little piece of ravioli, except in this context, it's just bizarre. The context should make you never even think of a piece of ravioli. And this was actually a poster used by the National Autistic Society in England, which took up this concept. And what it says here is when a person with autism walks into a room, the first thing they see a pillow with a coffee stain shaped like Africa, train tickets sticking out of a magazine, 25 floorboards, a remote control, a paper clip on the mantelpiece, and so on. And in the end it says, no wonder they don't notice you, or something like that. So it has been taken up as a concept that somehow seemed to fit something in clinical observation. Now, here is an experiment on rather low-level effect of context. And this is a very interesting visual illusion, and I hope you will experience it. Do you agree that these two circles are the same size? Yes. Okay. Now, are they the same size, or is one of them larger? And look, let me reverse it. They are really the same size, but it's an extremely compelling illusion to think that the one on the right is larger. We think it's larger because it's surrounded by the smaller one. This is an effect of context. Now, exactly this effect was studied by Francesca Happe in people with autism, because from our theory, this was our prediction. They should not be so much subject to this particular illusion. And indeed, they weren't, nor were their parents, interestingly enough. So here's Francesca Happe as she was then. Francesca Happe really did an enormous amount of work to elaborate this whole concept of central coherence, and she likes to call it detail focus style, and I think this is a much better name. But for historical reasons, I think I shall just keep with the old one. So here she did a study where you can see what is meant by detail focus in a drawing task. She shows here that a typical example of a child who's supposed to draw a house and starts with a window. It is unusual. Most children don't do that. It's not that they never do it. You see here the results between children with autism spectrum disorders. These are ADHD children. These are typically developing children. It is a huge difference in the kind of detail to whole starting point. And nevertheless, note, as she says, the final drawing is, of course, coherent and whole, despite the local bias. So it is quite a differentiated concept. According to Happe, central coherence is a cognitive style that's completely normally distributed, probably in the normal population, with most of us being in the middle, but some of us being at this weekend, piecemeal being very cheap, whole being costly, and some of us being on the other side of having, very strong, compelling interest in the overall gestalt. Now, I will give you also a brief update on central coherence. Of course, there have been interesting non-replications and others, and big reviews, for example, in a special issue in 2006, and Laurent Montron proposed his theory of enhanced perceptual performance, which I consider very similar, except it wants to say there is no problem with overall gestalt. It's just that they are so much better at the detail. I dispute this, but we will see what happens. There has been an interesting study by my PhD student Sarah White, which is still not published, where she actually did lots of tasks that supposedly tap central coherence and also tap mentalizing and executive function, and she found that there were, in fact, subgroups in this autism spectrum, and it was probably true only for about a third of her individuals. They were all very, very able, where you could see this, what I would call weak central coherence in a number of tests. And in these cases, it did not relate to IQ, it did not relate to mentalizing ability or anything else. It just seemed to be something extra. But let's talk about the last years now, up to date. Expansion and exploration, I called it. Search for other cognitive mechanisms. Of course, there is so much more to be explored and to be done to understand autism. I have to say it is slightly sad to me that at the moment, or in the last 20 years, there's been almost total focus on high-functioning subjects, and of course a rather unconstrained use of neuroimaging methods. People also look at siblings at risk and look for very, very early signs of autism. And at the same time, I think this is the most characteristic that happened, is this rather unexpected triumph of Asperger syndrome. Asperger was never mentioned. Kanad was the only one that was considered the pioneer of autism. And suddenly, Asperger syndrome has become a household name. It's quite remarkable. It's not just in research, but it is also in fiction and in films and everywhere. It is very interesting to me. Now, I can't not say something about another cognitive concept that is really relevant to the non-social behavior in autism, and that is top-down, failure of some top-down control. Some people call this executive function problem. And here is my way of explaining this, the dilemma of the supermarket. So you are in the supermarket and you say, what shall I do? Buy in bulk, get the special offer, save money, go for something novel, splurge out, all of these horrible choices to make. It's just too much information coming in. How do you distinguish relevant from irrelevant? And what we therefore need is this top-down attention. Plan some set biases like never buy special offers, or bad or something like that. And you enhance your perception on the basis of your prior intentions. So what you see is not this overwhelming jumble, but maybe it's a little bit like that if you are autistic, or at least many autistic people describe this kind of situation for them. And I just mentioned to you one experiment on top-down attention, how it modifies and enhances perception using a well-known and very beautiful paradigm by William, which uses faces and houses, because we know which area in the brain particular responds to seeing faces, particular responds to seeing houses. That's why this is so clever. The experimenter is the top in top down. The experimenter says, attend to the horizontal, houses are coming, or attend to the vertical, in this case, faces are coming, and there's a cover task to say whether they're same or different, but it's completely irrelevant what the performance is. Actually, the very, very brief flashes coming up. And yet, when you're prepared, there's increased activation in the face area when attention is directed to the vertical in this condition. So attention does modulate your sensory areas. And this is the experiment carried out with autistic people. And you can see very clearly that in the fusiform face area, there was this strong modulation of activation in the group of normal adults. And this is the autism group. Likewise, in the hippocampal place area, modulation perfectly fine in the normal group and very significantly less in the autistic group. Now, so I think that experiment is probably sufficient to say there is less top-down modulation in the autistic brain. But I have some more things to tell you, because I think the next frontier is the question about autism and talent. And all I want to do, and I hope that's okay in the last 5 minutes or so, to just to speculate whether the cognitive theories of the 80s I've talked to you about can actually help us to understand this link. Well, I've already said that people on the autism spectrum show some skills at much higher rates than any other clinical groups. And almost every person with some autism spectrum disorder is surprisingly good at something. For example, lining up toys with this very sweet little picture. Now, talents that are most common are in music, in art, calendar calculation, and of course in memory. There are commonalities between works of art of people who are completely independent, quite different, and I think you would agree probably with these two. You could say, yeah, that's detail, focused processing style, something like that. Now, of course, this is there are extraordinary achievements. This is Stephen Wiltshire, who has drawn here the skyline of Tokyo, but he's also drawn the skyline of other cities after a brief helicopter ride, say 20 minutes. He goes over the city and then he draws it. He takes maybe, I don't know, quite a few days to do it. He starts somewhere in the middle and he just goes on and on and on. Every window in every house, and he produces it from memory. It is really quite extraordinary. It is very, very detailed what he does. And it's not from a whole to little, but from little to other. So here are my very preliminary ideas. How can lack of mentalizing be linked with some of syndromes? Well, you can, of course. You're really free to follow your own interests. There is this lack of self-consciousness, which has to do with lack of mentalizing, and maybe this enables you to be what people call in the flow, which is kind of part of what we mean by creative talent. If there is reduced top-down control, which I'm convinced there is, sometimes you may get this release of talent due to a lack of inhibition. We know there is perseveration and repetition. That's one of the sort of diagnostic criteria by definition. And we know, I don't know whether you have the saying here in France, but people say that talent is 90% practice and 10% maybe something else. And if you play the piano for 10,000 hours, you will be a pretty accomplished performer. If you take drawing lessons for 10,000 hours, you'll be a very good artist. And if you do anything for 10,000 hours, that's quite enough. Now, well, maybe that's all that's needed. And then, of course, I would like to present that weak central coherence may be actually the engine of the savant talent. But let's see. So, lack of mentalizing. You are free to follow your own interests. Of course, if you're not interested in what other people like and value, and you're not so bound by fashion and convention, you have no blinkers put on you from shared thoughts. And also, you should consider that you don't spend any time or effort in what you could call the social savantism of everybody else who is not autistic. We could all be considered social savants, and we do spend 10,000 hours practicing our social skills, probably. Now, being in the flow may be easy to achieve some self-conscious performance, and I've given this example, which I found on the web, of being a tennis player and tossing. And these are the sort of descriptions of what you have to do if you're conscious. And you can see, you begin forward motion of your toss, keep your palm facing upwards. You want to tossing your hand to release the ball. It goes on, and actually some things can be done better without too much self-reflection. Reduced top-down control is interesting. Could there be something like release of talents through less inhibition? Well, we could think of children's art as a case in point. Prefrontal cortex is slowest to mature. There is less inhibition to overcome. Children seem to be particularly creative. But in adults too, you can temporarily remove the top-down control through TMS and maybe increase some skills. At least that's what Alan Snyder claims. We might be a little bit skeptical about this, but certainly we should not be skeptical about cases of so-called released talents through brain damage. So here is a woman called Anne Adams who has frontotemporal dementia, and she produces wonderful pictures which she never did before. Now, here's the 10,000 hours idea, and the idea of repetition. That's so typical in autism. Now, one of the famous savant artists is Gregory Blackstock, and it's very typical of him that he actually repeats. He has very repetitious pictures. I think they're absolutely lovely, and they are quite extraordinary things like fireworks or little, firework helicopters here. And he has to do each one, and all these birds and all these sorts of, lots of different kinds of things. And he does, I think, spend many, many hours doing this. Now we come to this, I think I should rush to the end. We have to have some discussion as well. This is, of course, my favorite, and you may well say, well, that is difficult. Could this attention to detail be the real engine of savant talent? And why not? I mean, how would we imagine this to happen? Is there some even very weak evidence for this? Well, I think there is a bit of evidence for this. For example, in music, you have the phenomenon of absolute pitch, which is really something like a piecemeal, a memory, an exact memory for the pitch of a tone. I mean, that is exactly not the same as a global understanding of a melody, where you have no idea whether it's a low pitch or high pitch, but you recognize the melody in any form or shape. But these musicians who have absolute pitch will not like it if this is changed. They really know what it should be. And this is interestingly present in all musical savants. It's also present in the at least 30% of people with autism, even if they have never had any music lessons or anything. Conversely, I didn't know this, but it's been found that musicians with absolute pitch, of course there are many, are a little bit more autistic-like than those who don't have it. Concerning art, there is very often a kind of a bottom-up approach from a detail, as in the case of Stephen Wiltshire, that seems to ignore the gestalt. And indeed, in art schools, I think this is often a method recommended for if you want to be accurate. That is the way to do it. Ignore the whole, start from the detail. Think about calendar calculation, one of the very, very favorite kind of special talents. There are a few observations about how this happens, how this is built up. And it does seem to start small. It does seem to start with very, very small regularities and expands from there, and it's added on, added on. It's not a kind of going from a whole concept of how the calendar might work, going down. What about memory? Well, the kind of memory we're talking about really is this road memory. That doesn't matter whether it forms meaningful things, and that there are exact exemplars if it's pictures, and it's verbatim content if it's words. So it does seem to suggest that these are the kind of typical SAML skills, and they all would benefit perhaps from this detailed focus. Now, with Francesca Happy, I edited this book called Autism and Talent 2 years ago, where we have a whole collection of papers. It's an edited book, and you see many different views on possible connection between autism, talent, and quite diverging views, and no real consistent answer. But I have got some slides from Francesca Happy, which I will show you quickly, about some more recent work of hers, which she's allowed me to show. She did a population study of 8-year-old twins, over 6,000 pairs, from a very well-known twin sample in the UK. And she used parental report of autistic-like traits that go into these areas of social communication impairments, and also so-called repetitive restricted behavior, as it's now called. And she asked parents to not only questions about these autistic-like impairments, but also whether the children have any special gifts in maths and arts and music and memory compared to other children, or compared to even older children. And what she found was that parents reported special abilities in some of their children. You can see here math at about 6%, memory 7%, music 3%, art 6%. And the next column shows you that the proportion of males in each. And this one shows you whether at the same time the parents reported autistic-like traits in their children. If it's an arrow down, it says it's more autistic-like. And you can see in every case, it's these repetitive, restricted activities that are more pronounced, not the social ones. So asking this question, what element is linked with talent, she found that definitely stereotyped motor mannerisms, some unusual intense interests are reported. Remember, these are totally normally developing children. Some question of rigidity and insistence on sameness, and also a persistent preoccupation with parts of objects. Now, naturally, parents weren't asked in those terms. What they were asked were things like, did your son or daughter appear to notice unusual details that others miss? If they say yes, that would count towards the detailed focus. And a question like, does she appear to have an unusual memory for details? So her results show that parental reports of special gifts in their children are significantly associated, first of all, with detailed focus. Really had the largest effect size. They were also associated with special interests. They were also associated with insistence on sameness. They were not really associated with any social factors or communication. Now, her conclusion is that if we want to explain talent, we may not look at autism per se, but some specific aspects of autism that predispose to talent. Mind blindness, the mentalizing failure, may enhance talents, but of course unlikely to instigate them. Detailed focus processing bias may be a starter motor for talent, and she has shown preliminary evidence of behavioral associations between special abilities and an eye for detail. But of course, you don't have to have autism to be talented, but perhaps it helps if you have this detail focus, or I would say weak central coherence type strategy. And I will leave it here. Thank you very much.